Hey guys, tonight we dive into one of the most iconic and, frankly, bizarre myths of all time, the story of Medusa. Picture it, you're standing there, in the depths of an ancient Greek temple, and across the room, you spot her, the beautiful maiden with golden locks that flow like silk in the wind. Medusa, the once stunning priestess of Athena, now cursed to become a creature of nightmares. Her hair, transformed into a mass of writhing snakes. And those eyes that could turn anyone into stone with a single glance. Sounds like a nightmare, right? But trust me, you probably won't survive this one. Yet, don't worry, there's a soothing twist hidden in this tale. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love hearing about all the time zones out there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medusa, the name itself brings to mind terrifying imagery. You've probably heard her name 100 times. She's one of the three Gorgons, a group of fearsome sisters who were cursed by Athena. Medusa's curse, however, was particularly unique. Once she was a gorgeous maiden, a high priestess in Athena's temple, dedicated to a life of service. But, as it often goes in these old myths, there was a twist of fate. Medusa caught the eye of Poseidon, the god of the seas. Unfortunately, Athena didn't look too kindly on this interaction, especially because it happened right in her sacred temple. The details of what happened next are a bit hazy. Did Poseidon assault Medusa? Or was it a love affair gone wrong? Historians still argue over this one, but whatever the cause, Athena wasn't having any of it. As punishment, she transformed Medusa's once beautiful locks into snakes, and worse, she gave her the ability to turn anyone who gazed upon her into stone. As the curse took hold, Medusa's life as she knew it was over. No longer could she walk freely in the world without people recoiling in fear, for her gaze could now petrify anyone who crossed her path. Her beauty, once her pride, had become her curse. Those long, golden tresses, the very essence of her former grace, had become a grotesque crown of serpents, wriggling and hissing with every movement. Can you imagine the constant noise? The slithering, the hiss of venomous fangs? It must have been maddening, a constant reminder of her punishment. No more could she laugh in the warm sun, feeling the breeze dance through her hair, like she had once done. Now, she was a monster, isolated, feared, and outcast from the world. Historians and mythologists still debate whether Medusa's transformation was entirely a punishment or perhaps a shield of sorts. Some believe that Athena's decision to turn Medusa into a Gorgon was a way to keep her safe from further harm. After all, the goddess had made Medusa's beauty a curse in itself, making her a target for lustful gods like Poseidon. But was it a protection, or was it merely the ultimate punishment for a mistake she hadn't even caused? Still, in the silence of her new life, there was something tragic about the idea of Medusa. What must it have been like to watch others live, freely, while she was locked away in the wilderness, her very appearance causing fear and death? The ancient Greeks, with their rich tapestry of gods and myths, weren't always kind to the flawed characters in their stories. In Medusa's case, she was both a victim and a villain, a fascinating duality that has echoed through time. Now, imagine the wind moving through the trees in her desolate cave as Medusa sits, perhaps quietly lamenting her fate. The air is still and cold, and there is an unsettling peace in the solitude. She's alone, but in that loneliness, there's a strange serenity. Maybe that's the calming aspect of Medusa's myth, the idea that even in the midst of terrifying transformation, there's peace to be found in isolation. Historians still ponder if this was Athena's hidden mercy, or simply the inevitable result of Medusa's own personal fall from grace. As Medusa's transformation took its toll, a new and strange chapter in her myth unfolded. She wasn't just a monster now, she was a creature of incredible power. That might sound counterintuitive when you think of someone whose hair is alive with snakes, whose very gaze can turn flesh to stone, but there's something about Medusa's myth that demands a deeper look. Historians still argue about the nature of her curse. Was it entirely a punishment, or was it a strange form of empowerment? Let's consider the goddess Athena for a moment. Why would she, one of the most powerful deities in Greek mythology, choose to punish Medusa in this way? Some scholars suggest that Athena's jealousy played a role in the decision, particularly since Medusa's beauty had once rivaled her own. Others believe that Athena saw in Medusa a reflection of the dangers of unchecked beauty, and by turning her into a gorgon, she stripped her of her allure, teaching both Medusa and the world a valuable lesson about vanity and divine wrath. But there's another theory: Medusa's punishment might have been a form of empowerment. When she was still a beautiful maiden, Medusa was vulnerable. She was subjected to the will of powerful gods like Poseidon. But after her transformation, she had the ability to defend herself against any intruder. Think about it, she became nearly untouchable. Her eyes could kill with a glance, and her hair, which had once been a symbol of her beauty, had now become her weapon. There's something chillingly powerful about the idea that Medusa, in the end, had control over her fate. And then there's Athena's role. Was the curse really a punishment, or was it a strange blessing in disguise? Historians have long debated whether Athena's jealousy clouded her judgment, or if she acted with some sort of hidden compassion for Medusa, offering her the power to protect herself from further harm. One thing is certain: Medusa became more than a helpless victim of circumstance. She was a force to be reckoned with, in her own way. For a moment, let your mind wander and imagine the scene: Medusa, standing in the shadows of her cave, her serpents writhing around her head, eyes glowing with an otherworldly power. She stands tall, defiant, a far cry from the helpless maiden she once was. Is there a sense of peace in that? A kind of eerie tranquility that comes with accepting your fate and mastering the power that once seemed like a curse? It's a strange thought, isn't it? But just as Medusa's life seemed to settle into this strange rhythm of isolation and power, the myth takes another turn. Enter Perseus, the hero of our story, armed with gifts from the gods themselves. If you've ever wondered how ancient heroes managed to slay terrifying monsters, well, it usually involved a bit of divine intervention. Perseus was no exception. In fact, his mission to find and kill Medusa was no ordinary task. He was a young man, and yet, with the aid of gods like Athena and Hermes, he was destined to become a legendary figure. Before we get into the thrilling details of Perseus' quest, let's talk about those divine gifts. Athena, ever the strategist, gave Perseus a polished shield. Not just any shield, this one was highly reflective, allowing him to look at Medusa's reflection instead of directly meeting her gaze. Hermes, the god of travel and trickery, gifted Perseus a pair of winged sandals, enabling him to fly. Finally, Perseus was given the sword that would sever Medusa's head. Armed with these incredible tools, he set out on what could only be described as a godly scavenger hunt. The journey was not easy, as Perseus had to first locate the three sisters of the Gorgons, who guarded the entrance to Medusa's lair. They were notorious for their ability to see everything, but they were also blind to the trickery of their brother, Hermes. Perseus, ever clever, approached the sisters and used his winged sandals to remain out of sight as he sought out the one Gorgon who had the power to turn people into stone. There's something almost calming in the precision of Perseus' mission. He was careful, methodical, prepared. It was no wild adventure but a task executed with the cool composure of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. Perhaps there was a certain peace in that, knowing that, despite the odds, everything was falling into place for him. No matter how daunting the quest might seem to outsiders, Perseus felt a sense of control, a sense of direction. Historians debate whether Perseus' success was due to his cleverness or to the overwhelming power granted to him by the gods. As Perseus got closer to Medusa's lair, the tension began to build. Would he be able to succeed where many others had failed? Was Medusa truly the monster they all claimed, or was she simply a product of divine manipulation, turned into a creature of terror by those who sought to control her? At last, Perseus reached Medusa's lair. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp stone and decay as he stepped into the dark, desolate cave where she lived. The sound of hissing snakes filled the air, their slithering growing louder with every step he took. Yet, as Perseus moved deeper into the shadows, he held steady, his reflective shield held up in front of him, allowing him to glance at the petrifying creature without looking directly into her eyes. It's strange, isn't it? How Medusa, once the symbol of beauty, had become so entwined with death and fear. But in a way, this shift in her identity was inevitable. She had been cursed, trapped in a world where every glance brought nothing but destruction. The same beauty that once made her the envy of gods and mortals alike had now become a deadly weapon. And here she was, quietly lying in her cave, unaware that the hero was closing in on her, waiting for the inevitable moment when their paths would cross. But there's something almost peaceful about the way Medusa met her fate. She didn't rush at Perseus or try to escape her cave. There's a moment of stillness before the final confrontation, one that some historians argue reflects Medusa's acceptance of her own demise. Perhaps after centuries of living in isolation, turning others into stone with every passing moment, she was ready for it all to end. It's as if the curse had, in some strange way, brought about a strange sort of peace. Historians still debate whether Medusa ever wanted to be saved or whether she had come to accept her fate long before Perseus arrived. As Perseus raised his sword, the tension in the air was palpable. Time seemed to stretch. In one swift movement, he cut off Medusa's head, the snakes writhing wildly as they were severed. The calm, reflective silence of the cave was shattered. Medusa, once a beautiful maiden turned terror, was no more. Yet, even in her death, there was a strange sense of calm. It was as if the chaos of her life, the constant transformation, the fear, the power, had come to an end. And in that stillness, there was peace. Perhaps that was the true end of her myth, the final moment where everything was put to rest, and the world could breathe again without fear. It's hard not to reflect on how Medusa's story mirrors the human experience. Beauty, power, and isolation. What are we without these? Can we truly understand someone's pain until we see it? Historians debate the true nature of Medusa's myth, but one thing is certain, her story will continue to captivate and challenge the minds of those who encounter it. As Medusa's severed head lay still in the cavern, Perseus looked down at the bloody trophy of his victory. The snakes that had once crowned her in a grotesque crown of living terror now lay in silence. Yet even in death, Medusa's legacy continued to loom large. Perseus, with his reflection shield still in hand, carefully placed her head into a bag, her power still potent, even in the stillness of death. The myth doesn't let us forget that her head remained a weapon of immense strength, capable of turning anyone to stone with a single glance. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Medusa's power didn't vanish with her death. In fact, it became even more pronounced. After Perseus' victory, the hero used Medusa's head to turn enemies into stone. It's almost as if Medusa's curse, the very thing that had condemned her to a life of fear and isolation, became a tool of great power in the hands of someone else. Her head, preserved in a way that no mortal could fully understand, continued to haunt the world long after her demise. Was it poetic justice? Some would say yes, others might argue it was a continuation of the curse, passed on from one person to another, unable to break free. Historians still argue over what this part of the myth really means. Some view it as a tragic irony. Medusa's power, once her curse, now becomes the instrument of control for others. It's as if the divine forces had trapped her in a cycle, where her only escape was through her power being wielded by another. It might even be a metaphor for how society views people who have been outcast or demonized. Their very isolation becomes their source of power, but it's never really theirs to control. What's interesting is how the myth has evolved over time. The ancient Greeks might have seen Medusa's head as a symbol of punishment, a tool that could bring ruin to enemies. But in modern interpretations, her image has taken on a new life, one that speaks to strength and resilience. People no longer see Medusa purely as a monster, but as a figure who, in some ways, embraced her power and used it to carve out a place for herself. Perhaps, in the end, Medusa wasn't a victim of her curse, but rather a tragic hero in her own right. And yet, as the world moved on, Medusa's head became something more than just a weapon, it became a relic. It was displayed as a symbol, a reminder of what had been conquered, but also of what had been lost. The curse of Medusa, though broken in a sense, lived on in the minds of those who had once feared her. As Perseus carried Medusa's head back to the gods, something curious began to happen. What was once the terrifying symbol of isolation and fear became an artifact of divine power, one that would continue to shape the course of the mythological world. While many saw it as a trophy, a reminder of the heroism required to defeat such a powerful creature, others began to question whether Medusa's story truly ended with her death. Could it be that her story was never meant to be one of defeat at all? Was she, in some twisted way, always meant to become a powerful symbol, one whose legacy would live on far beyond her tragic life? This, my friends, is where the line between myth and history becomes blurred. Ancient Greek myths were never static, they evolved with the people telling them. What started as a story of punishment became a legend of strength, of empowerment, and of the fine line between being a victim and becoming a victor. Historians still argue whether Medusa's transformation was a punishment, a lesson, or a strange form of liberation. Maybe it was all three. There's no definitive answer, and that's what makes her myth so enduring and mysterious. Throughout the ages, Medusa's head continued to play a significant role. Her image was used in art, on shields, and in temples, often serving as a symbol of protection. In a strange twist of fate, Medusa, who had been the very essence of danger, was now invoked to ward off harm. This paradoxical nature of her image, once a curse, now a shield, adds an eerie layer of complexity to her tale. How could something so terrifying, so destructive, become a guardian? And what does it say about the way society uses fear and strength to protect itself? For centuries, her myth has persisted, morphing into new forms. You can see her visage on modern-day imagery, in literature, films, and art, often reimagined as a figure of empowerment, not of terror. She's become a symbol of defiance against those who would oppress, a creature who, though cursed, found a way to wield her own power. Historians continue to study Medusa as both a symbol of power and as a reflection of the consequences of unchecked divine wrath. But one thing is clear, the myth of Medusa is no longer just about a monster with snakes for hair. It's about a complex, misunderstood figure who defied the odds and whose legacy still resonates today. Medusa's transformation is not merely a tale of horror, but a rich exploration of beauty, punishment, and the consequences of divine intervention. In many ways, her myth embodies the conflict between perception and reality. She began as a symbol of beauty, admired by all who saw her, and yet this very beauty, so celebrated in her earlier life, was what ultimately led to her downfall. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, bestowed a curse upon her, transforming Medusa into the horrific creature we know today. But there's an unsettling question that lingers in the shadows of the myth: was Medusa's punishment truly a form of justice, or was it the goddess's jealousy and cruelty that sparked this tragic transformation? Historians continue to debate the motives behind Athena's decision. Some argue that Athena's actions were not born out of malice, but rather from a place of protection. Was Medusa's beauty simply too dangerous? Was she a victim of her own allure, too enticing for the gods to ignore? Some scholars believe Athena's actions were an attempt to prevent further violence, specifically to protect the temple from the chaos that had ensued due to Medusa's beauty. But others point out that Athena's decision was rooted in jealousy, driven by the goddess's own insecurities. After all, if Medusa could tempt Poseidon, what would it say about Athena's own image and power? This duality in Medusa's story, her beauty as both a gift and a curse, has made her a timeless figure in Greek mythology. On one hand, she is a tragic victim of divine retribution, punished for a crime she didn't fully commit. On the other hand, she is a symbol of the destructive power of beauty, and the consequences that come with it. Historians argue whether she represents the darker side of femininity, an embodiment of beauty that, when abused, becomes something terrifying and dangerous. But over time, the myth has shifted. What was once seen as a story of divine punishment has, in modern retellings, evolved into something of a symbol for empowerment. The Gorgon's gaze, once a symbol of terror, is now understood by some as an image of strength. Instead of being a passive victim of her curse, Medusa becomes a symbol of resilience. She learned to embrace her monstrous form, wielding her power to defend herself against those who sought to harm her. The transformation from victim to empowered figure is one of the most fascinating elements of her myth. Could it be that Medusa, in some ways, is a tragic hero? Historians still argue this point, but one thing is clear: she remains a symbol of the complexities that come with power, beauty, and revenge. As we continue through the labyrinth of Medusa's myth, we see that her story doesn't just belong to her alone. It involves the actions of Perseus, the hero who slayed her, and the tools he used to accomplish the impossible. But what truly defines his role in the myth? Historians often focus on Perseus as the classic hero, armed with divine gifts and the guidance of the gods. However, Medusa's myth invites us to consider more than just the hero's journey. It invites us to ask whether the hero ever truly understood the complexity of the creature he was sent to kill. In ancient Greece, heroes like Perseus were often revered not just for their bravery, but for their ability to execute a task given to them by the gods. His mission to kill Medusa was seen as a challenge to his skill, to his courage, and to his divine favor. But as we look deeper into the myth, we can't ignore the unsettling reality of how the gods' intervention shaped the world around Medusa. Without Athena's shield, Hermes' sandals, and the sword of the gods, could Perseus have succeeded? Could he have truly slain the Gorgon with only his wits and strength? While Perseus' journey was indeed an arduous and dangerous one, it was heavily reliant on the divine gifts that guided him. His success, though admirable, comes with a sense of irony. He was not entirely the master of his fate. Perseus' story, much like Medusa's, highlights a significant theme in Greek mythology. There is always an unseen hand guiding events, and while the hero may be praised for their actions, it is the gods who ultimately pull the strings. And so, Perseus becomes the unwitting instrument of divine will, completing a task that was never truly his own. But here's where Medusa's influence lingers. Her legacy didn't end with her death at the hands of Perseus. Her head, severed and placed into a bag, remained a weapon of great power. While Perseus became a hero, it was Medusa's power that continued to shape the world. His use of her head, which could turn enemies to stone, was not a mark of his own strength, it was a reflection of Medusa's lasting influence. Historians still argue about how much Perseus understood the true nature of Medusa's curse. Was he just a hero doing as he was told, or did he recognize that Medusa's tragedy was not hers alone? Was he aware that, in using her head to defeat his enemies, he was perpetuating a cycle of power that had begun with her curse? Perhaps, just as Medusa had transformed from a victim into a figure of power, Perseus too, unknowingly, had become part of that transformation. As Perseus continued his journey, carrying Medusa's head with him, he became a figure who could not escape the influence of the creature he had slain. It's fascinating, isn't it? How a hero's quest can sometimes reveal more about the hero than the villain they're sent to defeat. Perseus' role in Medusa's myth is a bit of a paradox. On one hand, he is the shining hero of Greek myth, brave, clever, and favored by the gods. But on the other hand, he becomes the very thing that Medusa had once been, a vessel for a power far beyond his control. The consequences of using Medusa's head would ripple throughout his life, as well as the world around him. Medusa's severed head, with its petrifying power, continued to have a life of its own. In the hands of Perseus, it became more than just a trophy, it became a tool that would shape history. The hero used Medusa's head to defeat his enemies, turning them to stone, and even placing the head in Athena's shield, where it became an iconic symbol of protection. It's almost as if Medusa, in her death, became something that could no longer be controlled or tamed. Her curse, once a source of personal torment, had now become an instrument of divine power, wielded by those who sought to harness it. But there's something profoundly unsettling about this. Medusa was never truly defeated. She may have been slain by Perseus, but her influence continued to echo through the lives of those who came into contact with her. Her head, once the symbol of terror, became a symbol of power. Was it a fitting end to her story, or did it simply reinforce the idea that those who are cursed are often destined to continue influencing the world, even after death? Historians still debate whether Medusa's curse was truly a punishment or whether it was a strange form of empowerment. In the hands of Perseus, the Gorgon's head became an indomitable force, one that defied the natural order and offered protection to those who wielded it. Was this the ultimate irony? That the curse, which had been the source of Medusa's isolation and suffering, was transformed into something that could protect others. Perhaps in this way, Medusa's myth holds a deeper lesson about the nature of power, how it can be twisted, how it can survive even after its original bearer is gone. The reality of Medusa's death, and her continued influence through Perseus' use of her head, brings a certain depth to the story. It isn't just about the heroic slaying of a monster. It's about how the consequences of one act, one divine punishment, can have ripple effects far beyond what anyone could have predicted. In death, Medusa was not merely the victim of Athena's curse, she became something more. She became an enduring symbol of both the horrors of the gods' power and the strength that even the most tragic figures can impart upon the world. As we reach the heart of Medusa's legacy, we're faced with a strange, almost unsettling truth: her power never truly disappeared. Even after her death, Medusa's influence continued to grow, morphing into something far beyond what anyone had anticipated. It's curious, isn't it? How a curse, originally designed to punish, could evolve into something that held so much significance. After Perseus' victory and the subsequent use of Medusa's head, it became clear that the Gorgon's legacy was far from over. Medusa's head didn't just remain a trophy, it became an icon. The image of her severed head was used by the gods themselves as a powerful symbol of protection. Athena, the goddess who had cursed Medusa in the first place, took the head and placed it on her shield, the famous aegis, where it served as a deterrent to any who would dare challenge the goddess. It's almost poetic, isn't it? Medusa's terrifying visage, once a symbol of isolation and death, was now a shield, literally and figuratively, for the gods. Historians and scholars still wrestle with the symbolism of this. On one hand, Medusa's image is a powerful one, representing the wrath of the gods and the consequences of defying their will. But on the other hand, it also represents a shift. In the hands of Athena, Medusa's head was no longer just a weapon of destruction, it became a means of protection, a force for good. It's as if, in her death, Medusa had somehow transcended her curse. Instead of being the monster, she became a protector, guarding the gods from any mortal threat. The irony here is thick. Medusa, who had been punished for her beauty and turned into a deadly creature, now had her image used as a shield to protect those who had caused her downfall. This transformation of her head from an object of terror to one of protection is fascinating. Historians have often debated whether this is an act of redemption for Medusa, whether her myth, in the end, is one of empowerment rather than punishment. It's also worth noting that Medusa's image was not just confined to the gods' shields. Over time, it became a common motif in ancient art, often depicted in mosaics, pottery, and sculpture. In many ways, Medusa's severed head, far from being a symbol of her defeat, became a symbol of resilience. What was once a tool of vengeance had morphed into something that carried its own power, a power that even the gods sought to wield. So, was Medusa a victim of divine cruelty, or was she a symbol of power that could not be destroyed? Historians still argue over the interpretation of her story, but one thing is certain: her legacy, through her head and her image, has endured for centuries. Her myth is a reflection of the complexities of power and punishment, of victimhood and resilience. Even in death, Medusa was not silenced. She was made immortal, not as a monster, but as a force that could shape the world long after her transformation. After the dramatic end of Medusa's myth, you might think her story would simply fade into the annals of Greek mythology, lost among the thousands of ancient tales. But, as it often happens in these old stories, the legacy of Medusa persisted. The myth of Medusa didn't end with her death at the hands of Perseus; instead, it became a focal point in the ancient world for countless generations. Medusa's severed head, now housed in Athena's shield, continued to serve as a symbol of power. However, it wasn't just a symbol of divine protection, it became an enduring symbol of transformation itself. Here's where the story takes another curious turn. After Perseus' victory, the blood that spilled from Medusa's neck had remarkable consequences. According to some versions of the myth, the blood that flowed from Medusa's body gave birth to two new creatures, Chrysaor, a giant, and Pegasus, the famous winged horse. The blood, which had been the source of her curse, now became a source of new life. The idea that Medusa's death gave rise to something so beautiful and noble as Pegasus adds yet another layer of complexity to her myth. Think about it, a curse, something that once defined Medusa, became the catalyst for the creation of a creature who would soar high above the earth, freedom, beauty, and grace personified. Historians are divided on the interpretation of this part of the myth. Some see it as a form of redemption for Medusa, a recognition that even in death, her legacy was capable of giving life to something greater. Others, however, argue that it serves as a reminder of the power of the gods to shape the fates of mortals, even in their death. In many ways, the birth of Pegasus serves as a metaphor for the cyclical nature of life and death in Greek mythology. Medusa's life, filled with beauty, tragedy, and ultimately death, was not the end of her story. Instead, it was a transition, a passing of the torch to something new, something that carried her legacy into the future. The serpent-haired monster, once feared and reviled, became the mother of one of the most revered creatures in Greek mythology. But, of course, this raises a question that still lingers: was Medusa's ultimate fate truly a tragic one? Or, in the end, was she reborn through her blood, her power transforming into something noble and enduring? Historians still argue this point. Some view Medusa as the tragic heroine, a victim of the gods' cruelty. Others, however, see her as a symbol of resilience, a figure whose transformation led to a new chapter of creation and power. As Medusa's myth continued to evolve, the consequences of her death were far-reaching. Her severed head, now a divine relic, carried a strange duality. While Medusa herself had been a figure of isolation and tragedy, her head became a tool of great power, wielded by Perseus and, eventually, Athena. The irony is thick. Medusa, who had spent her life as a victim of divine wrath, found that her very curse was the source of her posthumous legacy. Her death did not mark her end, but the beginning of a new chapter where her power could still influence the world, even after her transformation. In one of the more poetic twists of the story, Medusa's head was not just a weapon, but an object of veneration. It was placed in temples, carved into statues, and used on shields. It became a symbol of both fear and protection. The ancient Greeks, ever fond of their symbolism, saw the image of Medusa as a powerful means of warding off evil. It was said that the sight of her face, even in death, could ward off danger, protecting the wearer from harm. Medusa, in her most tragic form, had become a figure of divine power, her image invoked to keep away those who would seek to destroy. Historians continue to argue whether Medusa's role as a protective figure truly reflects a redemption arc for her. Did the gods finally recognize the tragedy of her existence, or was her transformation into a symbol of protection simply another way for them to maintain control over her? The ambiguity of her myth adds to its richness. She wasn't just an object of terror or a victim, she had, in death, become a force that transcended the boundaries of her original curse. But what happens when we think of Medusa beyond the context of divine manipulation? What if Medusa's story speaks to the power of transformation itself, a process of change that is both destructive and regenerative? The myth suggests that even in death, there's something incredibly powerful about change, a theme that resonates deeply in many of the myths of ancient Greece. There's a dark beauty in this idea. Medusa's death was not the end of her. It was the moment when her power began to shift, to change form. What had once been her curse, the snakes, the petrifying gaze, became her strength. Medusa's severed head, far from being a symbol of defeat, became an emblem of something else entirely, something far more complex. Her legacy lived on, carried forward in the hearts and minds of those who sought protection and power. This transformation, this shift from a figure of fear to one of protection, encapsulates the strange paradox that defines Medusa. She was both a victim and a source of power, a monster and a protector. Historians may continue to debate her true nature, but one thing is clear: Medusa's legacy is one that endures, no matter how much time passes. She remains a symbol of the cyclical nature of life, death, and transformation, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is potential for change. As we move toward the final chapters of Medusa's myth, it's worth stepping back and looking at the larger picture of her legacy. Medusa's tale is not just one of monsters and heroes, it's one that reflects the way societies process and mythologize trauma, power, and punishment. The ancient Greeks, with their rich tradition of storytelling, used Medusa as a mirror to explore themes of beauty, fear, and transformation. And perhaps that's why her myth has survived, evolved, and resonated for centuries. Medusa is not a character easily defined by simple labels: victim or villain, monster or protector. She embodies contradictions, and in doing so, she invites us to confront the complexity of our own nature. After Medusa's death, the narrative shifts to focus on the repercussions of her life. It's important to note that her head was not merely a token of victory for Perseus, but a relic that continued to shape the course of history. The use of her head on Athena's shield is a powerful symbol of the Greeks' understanding of transformation. Medusa, through her suffering, became a symbol of both destruction and protection. In essence, she was no longer just a figure to be feared, she had become a part of the very fabric of divine authority. Her image was invoked to keep away evil, to ward off chaos, becoming, in the end, a source of security. What's fascinating is how Medusa's role continued to shift as her story passed through time. In the Middle Ages, Medusa's myth was reinterpreted. The Gorgon's image, once associated with terror, was repurposed in art and literature as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked vanity. Medusa's story became a cautionary tale about the perils of beauty, a narrative that aligned more closely with the values of medieval Christian thought. This shift from a figure of power to one of moral warning speaks to the way myths evolved to fit the changing cultural contexts in which they are told. However, despite these shifting interpretations, Medusa remained, in some sense, unchanged. Her hair, her gaze, her tragic fall from grace, all of these elements stayed intact, serving as enduring symbols of the complexities of beauty and power. It's striking how her image has been reimagined and reinterpreted through history, yet there's a continuity in how she's viewed as a figure of power, albeit a power that has often been feared and misunderstood. Today, Medusa is no longer simply the embodiment of divine retribution. She is a symbol of resilience, a representation of how one can turn a curse into strength. In modern interpretations, especially in feminist discourse, Medusa has become a symbol of female empowerment. Her transformation from victim to villain and ultimately to a figure of strength and defiance is something that resonates in contemporary narratives about overcoming adversity. This reinterpretation of Medusa's myth, one that acknowledges her suffering but also embraces her power, reminds us that myths are never static. They evolve, grow, and take on new meanings depending on the context and the values of the society telling them. Historians continue to debate the true meaning of Medusa's myth. Was she a victim of divine cruelty, or was she a tragic hero who found power in her transformation? Some argue that Medusa's story speaks to the destructive power of beauty, while others see it as a story of resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. Regardless of the interpretation, Medusa's myth endures. Her legacy, in all its complexity, continues to captivate and inspire those who encounter it, offering a reflection of the multifaceted nature of power, beauty, and the human experience. As we near the end of Medusa's myth, we reflect on the fascinating journey that began with her as a beautiful, innocent maiden and ended with her becoming one of the most powerful and enduring figures in Greek mythology. Her story, though tragic, is also one of transformation and resilience. The curse that turned her into a monster, the punishment inflicted upon her by Athena, became something much more complex as time passed. Medusa's transformation from a victim of divine wrath to a symbol of power, strength, and even protection, speaks to the way myths grow and evolve over centuries. By the time Medusa's head was mounted on Athena's shield and used to ward off evil, it became clear that her story was no longer just about fear and death, it was about legacy and transformation. Her image, even in its monstrous form, was revered, almost paradoxically, as a means of protection. Medusa, who had once been feared for her deadly gaze, became a symbol of defense, her legacy no longer defined by the curse she bore but by the power she could impart to others. Yet, in all her transformation, there remains a lingering sadness in Medusa's myth. She was punished not for a crime of her own making but for the actions of the gods. Her beauty, which had been her gift, became the very thing that condemned her. Even in her death, Medusa's power could not be contained. The blood that flowed from her neck gave birth to Pegasus and Chrysaor, symbols of life, freedom, and strength. It's as if the essence of her story could never be truly extinguished, always finding a way to persist and influence the world around her. The final reflection on Medusa's tale is a meditation on transformation. Her myth is one of tragic loss and empowerment in equal measure. It serves as a reminder that, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there is always the possibility of rebirth and change. Medusa's curse may have begun as a punishment, but it ultimately became her source of strength. Her story speaks to the idea that, no matter how dark or isolating our circumstances may seem, there is always the potential for something new to emerge from the wreckage. Now, as we bring this story to a close, take a deep breath and let go of any lingering tension. Medusa's myth, with its twists and turns, has offered us a glimpse into the complexity of power, beauty, and divine justice. And as we leave her story behind, know that her legacy, like all great myths, will continue to resonate, evolving and transforming with every new telling. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Sweet dreams.